The rifle cracked once. One shot, 800 meters, crosswind at 11 miles per hour. The target dropped. Nobody on that range said a word. Because 30 seconds earlier they'd been laughing at her. She was the woman they called a cafeteria girl. The one with no combat record, no unit patch worth mentioning, no name that meant anything to anyone in that lineup. Staff Sergeant Marcus Garrett had put her at the worst lane on the range, with a scope that hadn't been zeroed in 3 months, and ammunition pulled from the discard bin. He expected her to miss. She didn't miss. But that single perfect shot, that was just the beginning. What came after it would expose a corruption so deep inside this program that careers would collapse, records would burn, and the people who laughed loudest would have nowhere left to stand. If you've never subscribed to this channel, now is the moment. Hit that button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments. What city, what country are you watching from right now? I want to see how far this story travels, because what Maya Blackwood did inside that shooting program, nobody saw it coming. Nobody. The bus dropped her off at 0510. Fort Carver's Advanced Precision Course Facility sat at the edge of the base's western training corridor, separated from the main post by 2 miles of scrubland and a chain-link fence with a sign that read, "Restricted Access, APC Authorized Personnel Only." The morning was still dark, the kind of heavy, breathless dark that came just before the sky started deciding whether to turn gray or blue. Frost clung to the grass in thin white sheets. The air smelled like diesel and gunpowder and something older, that particular smell of a place where men had been sweating and competing and failing for a very long time. Private First Class Maya Blackwood stepped off the bus carrying a single duffel bag and a rifle case. She stood 5'4" in boots. Her uniform was clean, pressed, unremarkable. She wore no unit citation on her sleeve that anyone in the APC intake group would recognize. Her face was the kind of face that took a moment to register, not because it lacked anything, but because it didn't announce itself. Brown eyes that didn't move fast, a jaw set like someone who'd learned not to react. She checked the time. 0512. She was 2 minutes early. The other recruits were already clustered near the main range building, maybe 14 of them, all men except for one other woman who stood slightly apart from the group holding a thermos and staring at her phone. Most of the men had the look. The particular squared-off confidence of soldiers, who had been told they were special enough to be selected for an elite shooting program. Broad shoulders, unit tabs, the quiet arrogance of people accustomed to being the best shooter in their previous assignment. Maya found a spot near the fence line, set her duffel down, and waited. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't make eye contact. She pulled a small notebook from her breast pocket and made a few marks. Wind direction from the tree line to the west, the angle of the range lighting still burning orange against the dark sky, the setup of the target frames visible in the distance at the far end of lane 7. "You the cafeteria girl?" She looked up. 3 soldiers had drifted toward her. The one who'd spoken was built like someone who'd spent a decade behind a desk and 3 years overcorrecting for it in the gym, big through the chest and shoulders, a face that still carried the ghost of someone who'd been handsome before he'd started working too hard at it. He had a ranger tab on his left sleeve and a smirk that had probably gotten him through a lot of rooms in his life. "Heard a cook put in for APC selection," he said. "Didn't believe it." "MOS is 92G, she said, culinary. Before that, 11B. "Infantry?" He said it like she'd told him she was a licensed astronaut. 3 years. 3 years, no deployment, no combat record, and now you're here. He looked at the other 2 who were already grinning. "Sure, why not?" Maya looked back at her notebook. "I'm Kowalski," he said, not leaving. "That's Dennett, that's Rios. We all came out of the same SFAUC rotation. What's your background, honestly?" "I'm from Maryland," she said. Kowalski stared at her for a second, decided he didn't have a response to that, and moved off with his friends. She heard him say something as they walked away. The word toy floated back to her, and a sound that might have been laughter. She wrote something in her notebook and didn't look up. Staff Sergeant Marcus Garrett arrived at 0530 exactly. He came from the far end of the range building with 2 other instructors flanking him, walking the way some men walk when they've spent enough years in a particular place that the ground itself seems to recognize them. Garrett was in his early 40s, lean, angular, with close-cropped gray at his temples, and the eyes of someone who had stopped being surprised by other people's limitations a long time ago. He wore his experience the way other men wore rank, not loudly, but in a way that made the room understand it without being told. He stopped in front of the group and looked at them the way a carpenter looks at wood before he decides what to build. "Listen up," he said. Not loudly. He didn't need to be loud. "You are here because your units recommended you as candidates for advanced precision qualification. That recommendation means nothing here. Your previous experience means nothing here. Whatever you thought you were before you stepped onto this range this morning, set it aside. You're all blank pages as of right now." He walked the line slowly. "The APC course runs 6 weeks. You will be tested on fundamentals, advanced marksmanship, field conditions, and applied precision shooting under operational stress. The top performers will receive formal qualification and assignment recommendations. The bottom performers will be returned to their units with a report." He paused. "There is no middle ground." He reached the end of the line and stopped. "We have 16 candidates this cycle. That number will change. It always does." Then his gaze settled on Maya, and something shifted in it. Not dramatically, not with any particular heat, but in the way a man's attention changes when he encounters something that doesn't fit the expected pattern. "Blackwood," he said, "Staff Sergeant. MOS 92G. "Yes, Staff Sergeant. Your previous qualification scores were attached to your application. 318 out of 360 on the M4 qualification table. Expert badge. 2 cycles." He said it without inflection. "You understand this program operates at a significantly higher standard than basic qualification." "I understand. Good." He held her gaze for exactly 1 more second, just long enough to make the point without making a scene, then moved on. The other recruits didn't say anything. They didn't have to. The first week was designed to calibrate. That was the word Garrett used on day 2 during the platform brief. Calibrate. As in, the initial exercises weren't tests, they were measurements. Baseline data collection. Every recruit was being assessed on fundamentals: prone position, supported and unsupported, breathing control, trigger discipline, natural point of aim, before the program moved into the advanced material. Maya understood what that meant in practice. It meant the instructors were watching. Not just scoring. Watching. Paying attention to how each shooter moved, how they handled their rifle, whether their grip pressure changed under observation, whether their form collapsed when the shot broke. A lot of candidates who looked good on paper fell apart under that kind of sustained scrutiny. The act of being watched changed how they performed. It introduced a variable they couldn't control. It didn't change how Maya performed. She'd figured that out a long time ago. That the key wasn't to ignore the pressure, but to reframe it. Pressure was information. The tightness in your chest when an instructor stood 2 feet behind you with a clipboard wasn't a distraction. It was your nervous system telling you exactly what was at stake. You could use that. If you knew how to breathe through it, it became fuel instead of interference. She didn't tell anyone that. She just shot. On day 3, they ran the initial fundamentals assessment on lane 4. Standard M110 semi-automatic sniper system, which most of the candidates had handled before. The conditions were manageable: calm morning, no significant wind, supported prone position from a sand-filled rifle bag at a target set at 300 meters. The target was a standard paper silhouette with a scored zone breakdown. The X ring at the center, then the 10, 9, 8, 7 rings decreasing outward. The assessment wasn't publicly ranked on day 3. Garrett had said the initial results were for instructor reference only, used to assign lane positions and equipment packages for the duration of week 1. Maya shot a 10-round group, all 10 inside the 9 ring, 3 of them inside the X ring, though the X ring at 300 meters on a supported prone shot wasn't the achievement it would become at distance. Kowalski shot the lane beside her. He was good. Genuinely good. She could tell from the rhythm of his shots and the way he exhaled before the trigger broke. Clean technique. He caught her looking at his target when they went downrange to check and said, "Something to say?" "Group's pulling left," she said. "About 2 minutes of arc." He looked at his target, looked back at her. "You're welcome," she said, and walked back to the firing line. He stood there a moment longer than necessary. By the end of week 1, the social architecture of the class had calcified. Garrett's inner circle, the candidates he showed visible approval toward during range sessions, was clear. Kowalski. A soldier named Prentice who'd come out of a ranger battalion and shot with the kind of metronomic consistency that came from 10,000 repetitions. A tall, quiet man everyone called Breck, who had apparently made a name for himself in a competitive shooting circuit before enlisting. These three occupied the front of the range during instruction. They got Garrett's corrections delivered face-to-face, not through the megaphone. The other candidates occupied a kind of middle tier. Present, functional, unremarkable. And then there was Maya. Nobody told her to stay at the back. It wasn't that direct. It was more a matter of logistics arranged so that the back always seemed to be where she ended up. Lane assignments posted on the board put her consistently at lane 8, which was the farthest from the instructor platform and had the worst lighting in the range building. When the class moved to the outdoor range, she found herself assigned to the lane nearest the berm, where the wind behaved differently than it did for the other shooters. Not dramatically, but enough that a shooter who didn't know to account for it would drift. She accounted for it. On day 7, they ran the first formal graded exercise. Wind conditions, 500 meters, 5 rounds, timed string with a cold barrel, meaning no warm-up shots before the clock started. Each candidate's score was recorded on the official course sheet attached to a clipboard at the head of the range. Maya's 5-round group at 500 meters landed as follows: 1 round in the 9 ring at the outer edge, 2 rounds in the 9 ring closer to center, 1 round at the 9-10 ring boundary, 1 round clean inside the 10 ring. She'd called every shot herself. She had learned years ago to know where the bullet was going before the trigger fully broke. From the position of the crosshairs, the steadiness of her breathing cycle, the feel of the trigger's final quarter-inch of travel. She knew what her score was. When the clipboards went back to the instructor's station, she filed in line with everyone else to hear results. Garrett read the scores without commentary. Prentice, 48 out of 50. Breck, 47. Kowalski, 45. A string of mid-40s down through the class. Then, Blackwood, 38. She didn't react. She looked at him. He held the clipboard at a slight angle, just slight enough that she couldn't see the sheet from where she stood. 38, he repeated, and moved on. She'd shot a 43. Maybe 44. She knew it because she'd called every round and done the arithmetic standing at the firing point. 38 didn't match the targets. She said nothing. She went back to her lane, sat down on the bench behind the firing position, and opened her notebook. She wrote, Day 7, 500 meters cold barrel. Called score 43 to 44. Official recorded 38. Discrepancy 4 to 5 points. Lane 8 lighting poor but manageable. Targets not immediately available for individual review. Then she turned the page and wrote something else. Timestamps. By the end of week 2, she had a pattern. Not a suspicion. A pattern. There's a difference. A suspicion is something you feel in your gut because the situation makes you uncomfortable. A pattern is something you can write down and show to another person and have them come to the same conclusion independently. Maya had been doing the math every day. She'd started keeping a parallel log, her own shot-by-shot record of every scored exercise, maintained in the small green notebook she kept in her breast pocket. She noted her hold points, her wind call, her trigger timing, her perceived shot placement in each ring. Over 14 days of graded exercises, she'd built a data set. Her official recorded scores averaged 6.2 points per exercise below what her parallel log indicated. Prentice and Breck, whose lanes she could partially observe from lane 8, showed no similar gap. Their official scores matched, as far as she could determine, what their actual groups looked like on paper. That was the pattern, not random variance, not the natural fluctuation of human error in scoring. A consistent directional discrepancy that skewed in one direction only applied to one candidate in every scored exercise. On the 14th day, she arrived 40 minutes early to the range building. The scoring clipboards from the previous day's exercise were still in the instructor station at the back of the range building, filed in a manila folder inside an unlocked cabinet. She'd seen Garrett return them there the day before. The cabinet wasn't her concern. What was her concern was the whiteboard at the front of the range building, where the previous day's results had been written out in dry erase marker for the class to see before the board was wiped each morning. She stood in front of the whiteboard. She looked at the scores. Then she pulled out her notebook and compared them to the clipboard results she'd glimpsed at the moment Garrett had read them aloud. 3 scores had changed between the clipboard and the whiteboard. Not all of them. Not even most of them. 3. One was hers. One belonged to a candidate named Torres, who'd been quietly struggling and who Maya had noticed receiving less direct correction from the instructors than his errors warranted. One belonged to Prentice. His score had gone up by 2 points between the original clipboard and the whiteboard posting. She stood there in the empty range building for a long time, reading and rereading the numbers. Then she took out her pen and copied everything into her notebook with the date and time. The range building door opened behind her and Kowalski walked in, stopped when he saw her, and said, "What are you doing in here?" "Looking at the board," she said. "Range doesn't open for another 35 minutes. "I know." She capped her pen. "Your trigger discipline's tightened up since day one." He stared at her. "You started using your pad instead of the first joint," she said. "Better for this trigger system. Whoever told you to change it was right." She walked past him toward the door. "Blackwood." She stopped. "What's going on with you?" he said. "Not hostile, something closer to genuine." "Nothing," she said. "I'm just a cafeteria girl trying to keep up." She left before he could think of a response. The third week opened with a field exercise. They moved the class off the static range and into the training corridor, a 2-square-mile patch of terrain that mimicked forward operating conditions. Broken ground, variable vegetation, wind channels created by the natural topography. Targets were set at unknown distances. The candidates were given partner assignments and told to navigate to 3 designated hides, range their own targets, make their own wind calls, and engage within a specified time window. Maya was assigned to partner with Torres. Torres was 24 years old, from Albuquerque, 2 years into his first enlistment, and he shot with a careful, methodical precision that would have been an asset in a different environment. He thought too long. The analytical part of his brain hadn't learned yet to compress the decision cycle. He'd run through his wind calculations correctly, but take 30 seconds where a proficient shooter needed 8. "You're overthinking the correction," she told him at the second hide, while he was working through his dope card for a target she estimated at 420 meters on a slight quartering headwind. "I'm being thorough," he said without looking up. "You're being slow. There's a difference." She looked through her spotting scope. 410, not 420. Winds quartering at about 9 miles an hour from 2 o'clock. Hold point 6 inches right, quarter mil above center. "How did you—" "The grass in the draw." She nodded toward a shallow depression 30 meters to the left of the target. "Watch the seed heads. They're telling you what the air's doing. Use them." He looked. He saw it. His expression changed slightly. "Make the shot," she said. He made the shot. Center mass. He looked at her. "You should be partnered with Prentice or Breck." "Maybe," she said. "Why aren't you?" She didn't answer that. They reached the third hide at the end of a long draw that put the setting sun directly in their faces. The target was set at what Maya read as 580 meters, a long shot for the program at this stage, likely a stretch target meant to separate the upper tier from the pack. The wind at that range was inconsistent. There was a thermal running off the elevated ground to the right that shifted the corridor unpredictably between shots. Garrett appeared at the hide assessment point 20 meters back with a clipboard and a partner instructor. He looked at Maya's scope setup, looked at her dope card, and said, "What's your hold?" "0.4 mil up, half mil right." "Wind's running 6 miles per hour from 9 o'clock, he said. "Straight cross. Your hold should be 3/4 mil right." She looked at the grass. "Wind's variable," she said. "There's a thermal off the ridge. At the moment of the shot, it'll be around 4 miles an hour gusting from 11 o'clock. Half mil is the correct call." Garrett's jaw moved slightly. Not a smile. The opposite of a smile. "Shoot," he said. She shot. The target fell. Garrett made a mark on his clipboard without comment and moved to the next hide. Torres looked at her. She was already breaking down her position to move. "Half mil right," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "Watch the grass," she said. "Always watch the grass." On day 19, the program received a visitor. Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Harlow, the officer in charge of the APC program's Parent Training Command, arrived for a mid-course inspection. He was a compact, precise man in his mid-50s who carried himself with the specific economy of motion that belonged to people who had spent a lot of time in places where unnecessary movement got you killed. He walked the range, spoke briefly to Garrett, reviewed the interim scoreboards posted in the administration area, and spent approximately 8 minutes watching the afternoon firing exercise from the observation platform. Maya noticed him notice her. Not conspicuously. She was on lane 8, working through a supported prone position on a 600-meter target in deteriorating afternoon light, and when she came off the scope after her string, she caught him watching her lane specifically from the platform. Not the class as a whole, not Prentice's lane where the top scores were happening, but hers. He said nothing to her directly. He left at 1600, and by 1630 Garrett had called the class into the range building for an early close. Interim performance review, Garrett said. We are at the midpoint of the course. Some of you are performing at the level this program expects. Some of you are not. He looked at his clipboard. 2 candidates are currently on administrative warning status due to insufficient progress in fundamental criteria. Those candidates will be notified individually. He set the clipboard down. Everyone else, we continue. That evening, a name appeared on the separation paperwork posted to the board outside the administration office. Torres. Maya stood outside in the cold and read it for a long time. Torres had been shooting better since week 2. His decision cycle had compressed. His groups had tightened. Whatever deficiency had put him in warning status, she'd watched him work through it with a consistency that most of the class hadn't matched. She went back to her bunk, opened her notebook, and found the page where she'd written down Torres's observed group data from the field exercise. She compared it to his official interim score. The gap was larger than hers. She sat with that for a while in the dark. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote one word at the top. Documentation. Beneath it, she began a new log. Not just her own scores, but everything she could reconstruct. Torres's observable groups, shot placement she'd witnessed firsthand, the timing of score postings relative to when exercises ended, the whiteboard discrepancy from day 14. It was going to take time, but she had 6 more days before the final qualification week, and somewhere in the numbers something was going to break. She found the first real fracture on day 22. The program used a digital scoring interface for the official range records, a tablet system that the instructors carried on the range and synced to the program database each evening through the administration office terminal. Maya had no access to that system, but the administration office had a civilian contractor running logistics support, a woman named Delgado, late 30s, who handled equipment requisitions and administrative filing, and who had the particular exhausted look of someone who had been watching things go sideways in a professional environment for long enough that they'd stopped being surprised by it. Maya had started talking to Delgado 3 days earlier, not about the scores, about logistics, about the ammunition requisition process, the equipment issue records, the chain of documentation for range materials. On day 22, she asked Delgado a specific question. The scoring records from the tablet system, she said. Do they auto-timestamp when entries are made, or is the timestamp manually applied? Delgado looked at her with the particular stillness of someone who has just heard something they were not expecting. Auto, she said carefully. Server side. They can't be changed from the instructor tablet after sync. When does the sync happen? End of range day, usually between 1800 and 1900. And if an instructor modified an entry between the time they logged it on the tablet and the evening sync, Delgado's eyes shifted toward the door behind Maya. Just briefly, then back. There'd be a version log, she said quietly. The system keeps every version. It's a compliance requirement. Maya nodded slowly. That version log, she said. Who has access to it? Delgado didn't answer immediately. The program administrator, she finally said, and the training command inspector. Lieutenant Colonel Harlow. Yes. Maya thanked her and left. She walked back to the barracks in the cold, counting her steps the way she counted her breathing on the range. Not obsessively, but with attention, because attention was the thing that kept everything from falling apart. She had 24 hours before the final qualification exercise began. She had a notebook full of parallel data. She had a version log she couldn't access. And she had one question left that she didn't have the answer to yet. Who else had they done this to before she arrived? The answer to that question was sitting in the administration files, somewhere behind Delgado's desk, in a folder that probably had a name like Previous Cycle Performance Records or Historical Qualification Data. Maya needed to see it, and she had exactly one idea for how to make that happen. She looked at the sky. Overcast, the clouds sitting low and gray over the range, the kind of sky that meant the weather would shift overnight. The final qualification day was tomorrow. The wind, she noted automatically, was running from the northwest at about 12 miles an hour. By morning, it would be different. It was always different by morning. She just had to be ready for whatever it became. She gave herself until 2200. That was the window, the 2-hour stretch after the evening range cleanup, when the administration building dropped to skeleton staffing, when Delgado was usually the last civilian in the building finishing requisition paperwork before locking up for the night. Maya had watched the pattern for 3 days, not obsessively, just the way you watched any terrain feature that mattered, with enough attention to understand its rhythm. She didn't go through the front. The side entrance to the admin building connected through the equipment cage corridor, which stayed unlocked until 22:30 for late gear returns. She walked in carrying her cleaning kit. Plausible reason, documented purpose. Nothing that would look wrong on a camera if anyone checked. She moved through the corridor to the back office where Delgado worked late, knocked twice, and opened the door. Delgado looked up from her desk. She had reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a paper coffee cup that had been refilled enough times. The cardboard was starting to go soft at the seam. "You shouldn't be in here," Delgado said. "I know." Maya closed the door behind her. "Previous cycle performance records. I need to know if the pattern I'm seeing this cycle matches what happened before." Delgado didn't say anything. She looked at Maya over the rim of her glasses with the particular expression of someone running a fast internal calculation between two things they didn't want to choose between. "I can't give you access to those files," she said. "Can you tell me if they exist?" A pause. "Everything exists," Delgado said carefully. "Every cycle. It's all archived. And if someone were to compare the official scoring records from the last 3 cycles against the raw tablet entries in the version log, they would need authorization from the training command inspector." Delgado set her pen down. "Or a formal complaint routed through the IG office with supporting documentation." Maya looked at her. "How much documentation?" she said. Delgado picked her pen back up. She clicked it twice without writing anything. "Enough that a reasonable person looking at it independently would reach the same conclusion," she said, "without being coached toward it." She turned back to her paperwork. The conversation, as far as she was concerned, was over. But she'd angled her monitor slightly as she turned. Not dramatically, just enough. And the screen was facing outward, and the file directory open on it showed a folder tree that Maya could read from where she stood. Previous cycles. APC program records. Qualified personnel archive. 3 folders below that, with dates. Maya memorized the folder names and left. She walked back to the barracks in the dark, the northwest wind pressing against her left cheek, and she thought about her grandmother. Not sentimentally, she thought about her grandmother the way she thought about ballistics, as a series of facts that had shaped the conditions she was currently operating in. Eleanor Blackwood had been a marksman in an era when the word marksman didn't apply to women in any official document. Whatever she had accomplished had been accomplished in the margins of records that didn't acknowledge her, in the gaps between what the institution was willing to write down and what had actually happened. Maya had grown up hearing fragments of it, pieces that came out sideways over kitchen tables and in the back of long car rides, never directly, always as if the full story existed somewhere but had been decided, at some point, not to be hers. She had learned to work in the margins too. It was, she supposed, the only inheritance that had transferred cleanly. She went to her bunk and did not sleep for a long time. When she finally did, she dreamed of nothing. That was how she knew the morning was going to be hard. The final qualification week opened on a Monday with a weather briefing. The range safety officer, a warrant officer named Capello, who had the detached professionalism of someone who had seen enough range accidents that no amount of paperwork surprised him anymore, stood at the front of the range building and ran through the forecast with a laser pointer and a printed weather chart. Overnight front had moved through faster than predicted. The northwest wind that Maya had clocked at 12 the previous evening had shifted to a west-southwest flow running between 15 and 22 miles per hour, gusting. Cloud ceiling was low. Temperature had dropped 8 degrees. The outdoor range conditions were rated as marginal for precision work at distances above 600 meters, but within program parameters for continuation. "We're running the schedule as planned," Garrett said when Capello finished. "Adjust your dope. That's what you're here to learn." The class filed out to the range. Maya stood at lane 8 and looked at the wind. At 600 meters, with a crosswind running 15 to 22 and gusting in that range, the correction window was wide, too wide to apply a single static hold. You had to read the shot. Watch the mirage, watch the vegetation, watch the flag at the range boundary, and the way it dropped and lifted and flattened. You had to feel when the wind paused between gusts and understand that a pause wasn't the same as calm, that the air was still moving even when the flag hung straight. Her grandmother had told her that once. Not in those words. In the specific way that the specific person she'd been would have said it. The flag lying flat isn't rest, baby. It's just catching its breath. Maya set up her position, checked her dope card, made 3 adjustments to her rear bag for elevation, settled into the stock. Garrett walked the line behind the firing positions. He stopped briefly at Prentice's lane, said something quietly, moved on. He passed lane 8 without stopping. The range went hot at 0742. The first string of the final qualification week was a 5-round cold barrel group at 500 meters, same format as the initial assessment. A direct comparison point designed to show individual progress over the course. Your day 1 score against your final week score, with the delta representing your demonstrated development. Maya shot her string in the following order. She waited through 1 full gust cycle to establish the rhythm of the wind, then broke her first shot on the trailing edge of a gust pause. The round hit the 9-10 boundary. She adjusted her mental hold by a quarter minute, breathed, broke the second shot at the same phase of the next gust cycle, inside the 10 ring. Third shot, identical process, 10 ring. Fourth shot. She felt the wind shift mid-breath, held, waited an additional 3 seconds for the gust to complete, broke it clean. 10 ring. Fifth shot. The wind did something she hadn't seen it do all morning. It momentarily reversed, a brief eddy coming back off the berm at the far end of the range. She was already 2 pounds into the trigger when she felt it. She let off, rebreathed, shot on the pause that followed. Inside the 10 ring, 4 rounds in the 10 ring, 1 on the 9-10 boundary. She came off the scope, noted her called placements in her notebook, wrote the time, 0751, and waited for the range to go cold. When they went down range to check targets, Kowalski looked at her group from the lane over. He didn't say anything. He just looked at it for a second longer than the situation required, then looked at his own target, which was a solid group, consistent, well-controlled, but wider than hers by a margin that was visible at a glance. He went back to his lane without comment. That afternoon, they ran the first of 3 field position strings, no bench, no bags, natural support only from the terrain provided. Candidates were assigned individual positions that had been prepped the previous afternoon by the program cadre. Hasty hides dug into the slope of a low rise, vegetation disturbed and partially restored, each position presenting a slightly different angle and support geometry. Maya's position was the last one on the right end of the line, which put her on a reverse slope that required her to build her position with negative angle to the target, a downhill shot at 450 meters, which changed the ballistic geometry in ways that a shooter who hadn't studied it would underestimate. The round traveled faster on the downhill portion of its arc. The effective distance was shorter than the measured distance. If you ran your standard dope without correcting for angle, you'd shoot high. She corrected for angle. She ran her string. All 5 rounds in the scoring zone, 4 of them well inside. Garrett reviewed the positions after the exercise. He came to hers last, looked at the target through a spotting scope, wrote something on his clipboard, and said nothing to her directly. She watched him write. The pen moved for what seemed like a shorter time than the notation should have taken. She thought, I need to see that clipboard before it goes to the tablet. She thought, that's not going to happen. She thought, then I need another way. The second day of qualification week was when Kowalski started paying attention. Not in the way he'd been paying attention before. The sideways observation, the commentary from a safe distance. He started paying attention the way a soldier pays attention when he's recalibrated his threat assessment and isn't sure yet what to do with the new information. It started at chow. Maya was eating alone, which was her standard configuration. She had her notebook open beside her tray and was working through the previous day's numbers. Not writing, just reading, running comparisons. Kowalski set his tray down across from her without asking and sat down. She looked up. Downhill shot yesterday, he said. You corrected for slope. Yes. Cosine correction? Roughly. I didn't run the formula in the field. I estimated from experience. What experience? He said it without the edge he'd had in week 1, genuinely asking. My unit did a lot of mountain shooting, elevation transitions. She closed the notebook. You adjusted your come-ups between the 500 and the 600 station yesterday. Most people don't bother. I noticed the velocity shift. So did I. He ate a few bites, looked at the wall. You're scoring higher than they're posting, he said. Just like that, flat, not a question. She looked at him. I'm not stupid, he said. I've got eyes. I saw your group yesterday. You shot a 46 minimum. They're not going to post 46. What do you think they'll post? She said carefully. Whatever keeps you where they want you. He pushed his tray aside. Look, I don't know what's going on, but I know what a 46 group looks like, and I know what a 38 group looks like, and those are not the same thing. She was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me this? Because I came here to find out who actually shoots, he said, and I've been watching the wrong scoreboard. He picked his tray back up. That's all. He left. She sat there with her notebook and her food and thought about how much the situation had just changed, and whether that change was something she could use, and whether using it would cost him something she didn't have the right to spend. She ate the rest of her meal. Didn't write anything. Some things you had to carry in your head until you knew what to do with them. Day 3 of qualification week brought the stress shoot. This was the exercise the program used to benchmark performance under physical and cognitive load. Candidates ran a quarter-mile obstacle course through the training corridor, carrying rifle and kit, then immediately transitioned to a timed shooting sequence on a series of targets at varied distances from 200 to 700 meters. The physiological stress of the run elevated heart rate and disrupted respiratory rhythm. The timed element created cognitive pressure on top of the physical. It was designed to expose the gap between a shooter's static range performance and their performance when the body was compromised. Maya had been thinking about this exercise for 2 weeks. She had a particular problem with it that she hadn't told anyone. She had a joint issue in her left knee. Not a serious one, not one that appeared on any medical record because she'd managed it carefully enough that it had never crossed the threshold into something a doctor needed to know about. On flat terrain it was irrelevant, but the obstacle course moved through broken ground with 2 significant elevation changes, and the combination of descent under load and the lateral pressure of the scramble section was the kind of thing that could light it up in a way that would affect her stability on the shooting platform. She'd adapted her kit the night before, knee sleeve under her uniform trousers, low profile, invisible under the fabric. She'd adjusted her shooting position slightly to reduce the lateral load on the joint during the prone sequence. She'd accepted that some portion of her performance on this exercise was going to be managed rather than optimized. That was the reality. Not every problem had a clean solution. Some of them you just managed. The class gathered at the start line at 08:30. The air was colder than the previous 2 days, the wind down from the day before, maybe 8 miles per hour from the west, consistent, no gusting, better conditions. The sky was still overcast, but the ceiling had lifted. Visibility was clean. Garrett stood at the side of the start gate with his stopwatch and the course safety evaluator. Interval start, he said. 60-second separation between candidates. Lane assignment sequence. Blackwood, you're last. Last meant the longest wait. Last meant watching 14 other candidates run the course in transition, hearing the shots, absorbing the crowd noise and the pressure accumulation. Last meant, she understood this, that if she had an exceptional run, Garrett would be the only instructor present for the transition sequence, because the others would have moved up range to assist the candidates who'd gone before her. Last was designed to make her invisible. She used the weight. She stood at the start line after the 14th candidate went, breathing slowly, watching the course. She identified the line through the descent section that would take the least lateral load off her knee. She counted the rhythm of the wind against the range vegetation. She thought about her grandmother running a qualification she wasn't supposed to be running, in a place she wasn't supposed to be, with equipment that wasn't meant for her, in a system that was already writing down a score before she took the shot, and making it anyway. Blackwood. She stepped to the line. Go. She ran. The obstacle course was brutal in the specific way that all well-designed obstacle courses were brutal. Not through any single feature, but through accumulation. The first obstacle was a low crawl through a 30-meter section of netting strung 2 feet off the ground, which put immediate strain on the shoulders and required rapid transitions from prone to upright at both ends. Then a log climb, 8 feet of rough timber with knotted rope, the wood wet from the previous night's moisture and slick under her gloves. Then the descent section, her concern, the steep drop with loose shale under the topsoil, the kind of ground that wanted to take your knee sideways if you let it. She didn't let it. She shortened her stride on the way down, kept her weight back, felt the joint complain briefly on the third step, and then settle as the angle eased. The lateral scramble came at the base of the descent, a 120-meter traverse along a low concrete barrier that required the shooter to move laterally, rifle in hand, stepping over and through sections of the barrier without stopping. It was designed to disrupt the shooting position muscle memory. After the scramble came a final 30-meter sprint to the transition mat where the shooting sequence began. She hit the mat at 1 minute 57 seconds. Her heart rate was up. She could feel it in her temples, in the pulse against the stock when she settled into prone. She breathed. Not through the sprint recovery instinct that wanted to pant it out, but through the deliberate process she'd practiced enough times that it functioned even when the body was arguing against it. 7 seconds on the mat before her first shot broke. Her standard was 6, 1 second over. She didn't rush to make it back. A rushed shot at 200 meters cost nothing on the clock and everything on the target. She breathed, found the grip, broke the shot at 7 seconds. The 200-meter target fell. She moved to the 350, adjusted for the transition, shot, fell. The 500 was where the heart rate was going to matter most. Any residual elevation in her pulse would translate to a visible wobble in the reticle, and at 500 meters on a timed string, there was limited time to wait it out. She had to shoot through it. Find the rhythm between heartbeats, the brief plateau between systole and diastole where the reticle steadied, and break the trigger in that window. She did. The 500-meter target fell. The 700 was the stretch. It always was. Her wind call going in was 8 miles per hour west, 0.6 mil right, standard hold for her rifle system. But something had shifted in the time she'd been shooting. She could see it in the mirage shimmer at the mid-range point, a slight rotation that suggested the wind had backed off a degree or two. She held 0.5 instead of 0.6. She broke the shot. The target rocked. Not a clean hit, a graze, maybe a marginal zone edge. She accepted it, made a note in the back of her head, moved to the 400-meter wrap shot that closed the sequence. The 400 fell clean. She cleared the weapon, stood, and found Garrett 4 meters behind her with his clipboard. He was writing. She couldn't see what he was writing. She said nothing. She picked up her kit and walked back to the staging area. Behind her, she heard the pencil stop, then start again, then stop. That evening, the scores from the stress shoot went up on the whiteboard. Maya was in the barracks when Kowalski appeared at the door of the common area. He didn't come in. He stood in the doorway and said, "Boards up." She went to the range building. The scores were written in order of performance. Prentice at the top. A strong run, deserved. She'd watched him transition, and his recovery time was genuinely impressive. Breck second. 3 more candidates clustered in a tight band below them, then a spread through the middle of the class. Her name near the bottom. Score, 31 out of 50. She had shot a 42. 43 including the marginal 700-meter hit if the range safety officer had called it in. Even without that round, she'd shot a 40. Easy. 31. She stood in front of the board and read the number and breathed. Kowalski was beside her. "That's not what you shot," he said quietly. "No." "What are you going to do?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the number on the board. 31. Written in blue marker, her name next to it in Garrett's handwriting. And she thought about Delgado's file directory. She thought about version logs and timestamps and the folder labeled Previous Cycle Performance Records. She thought about Torres, who had shot well enough to stay in this program and was gone anyway. "I need one more piece," she said. "What piece?" "The previous cycles. If the pattern's consistent across more than one cycle, it's not administrative error. It's policy." Kowalski was quiet for a moment. "Delgado," he said. She looked at him. "She's been here 4 years," he said. "She knows. I could tell when she handed me my issue paperwork on day 1, the way she looked at the candidate roster. Something in her face." He paused. She's been waiting for someone to ask the right question. I asked, Maya said. You asked alone. He held her gaze. Ask again, with a witness. She thought about that. About what it would cost him if this went wrong. About whether she had the right to bring someone else into a situation that was already dangerous in the specific way that institutional confrontations were dangerous, not dramatically, not with immediate physical stakes, but in the slow, grinding way that could end careers and transfer records and make a soldier's next 5 years a punishment for one moment of honesty. You understand what you're offering, she said. I understand that I watched a 31 get written next to a 42 group, he said, and I'm a ranger. We're not supposed to be okay with that. She looked at the scoreboard one more time. 31. Tomorrow, she said, before the morning range session. He nodded and left. She stayed in front of the board for another minute, alone, reading the numbers in the quiet of the empty range building. The wind outside had picked up again. She could hear it working against the eaves, that low, pressured sound it made when it was building toward something. She thought about her grandmother in the margins of a record that didn't acknowledge her. She thought about the version log sitting in a server she couldn't access. She thought about the final qualification exercise, 2 days away now. And what it would mean if she walked onto that range and shot the way she was capable of shooting and had the score changed again, one more time, with everything documented and prepared and still not enough. She thought about all of that. Then she turned off the range building lights and walked back out into the dark, and the wind hit her from the west, strong and cold, and completely indifferent to what any of them were doing. 8 miles per hour, she noted automatically. Maybe 9. By morning it would be something different. It always was. She was at Delgado's office at 05:10. Kowalski was already there, standing in the corridor outside the equipment cage with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the particular stillness of someone who had made a decision and wasn't second-guessing it anymore. He'd beaten her by 5 minutes. She didn't comment on that. She just nodded and knocked on Delgado's door. The light was on inside. It was always on. Delgado got in early because the paperwork didn't stop accumulating just because the range went quiet. Come in, Delgado said, and then looked up from her desk and saw both of them and set her pen down with a deliberateness that meant she'd been expecting something like this, if not exactly this. I need a witness present, Maya said. He's it. Delgado looked at Kowalski, looked at Maya, looked at the door behind them, which Maya had already closed. Sit down, Delgado said. They sat. Delgado was quiet for a moment. She took her reading glasses off and set them on the desk beside her pen, and without them her face looked older and more tired, and the tiredness in it wasn't the tiredness of a bad night, but of a long time carrying something she hadn't been able to put down. Previous cycle records, she said. Not a question. 3 cycles back, Maya said. I want to know if the scoring discrepancy pattern I've documented in this cycle appears in the historical data. Same directional bias, same candidate profile. Anyone who represented a performance threat to the preferred candidates. Delgado looked at the window. The sky outside was still fully dark. In 2 hours, the range would open, and this conversation would become a lot harder to have. If I pull those records, Delgado said, and someone asks me why, the version log, Kowalski said, is it intact going back 3 cycles? Delgado's jaw tightened slightly. Yes. Then you pull the records because you're conducting a routine archival audit, documentation compliance check. You do those regularly. I do, she said slowly. So this is one of those. He held her gaze. You're not doing anything wrong. You're doing your job. The silence in the office had weight to it. Outside, a vehicle moved somewhere on the far side of the post, headlights crossing the frosted window glass in a brief orange sweep. Delgado opened her bottom desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder that was already thick with paper. She set it on the desk between them. This audit was started 2 weeks ago, she said carefully. Routine compliance review. You're welcome to observe while I work through it. She opened the folder. As witnesses. Maya leaned forward. What she saw in the next 40 minutes rearranged everything. 3 cycles. 18 months of APC program records, laid out in Delgado's careful administrative handwriting in the audit comparison sheet she built in real time, pulling from the version log printouts she'd evidently been compiling since before Maya arrived. The version log showed every entry made to the digital scoring system, with server-side timestamps, when a score was entered, when it was modified, and what it had been before the modification. The pattern was not subtle. In the previous 3 cycles, a total of 9 candidates had shown consistent downward score adjustments in the official record relative to the original tablet entries. All 9 shared specific characteristics. They were performing at or above the level of the program's preferred candidates. They had no prior relationship with the program cadre, and they did not fit the demographic profile of the candidates who consistently advanced. The adjustments averaged between 4 and 7 points per exercise. Applied across a multi-week program with a cumulative scoring threshold for qualification, that margin was the difference between advancement and elimination every single time. 3 of those 9 candidates had been eliminated before the final qualification exercise. 2 had dropped voluntarily. She could read between the lines of that. Voluntary withdrawal that followed weeks of being told through official scores that you weren't good enough was a particular kind of manufactured consent. 4 had completed the program with official scores that classified them as marginally qualified, producing assignment recommendations that were functionally useless. Not one of the 9 had formally complained, because complaining required documentation. And the documentation was in the system that the people you were complaining about controlled. Until now. Delgado squared the pages and set them back in the folder. Her hands were completely steady. "This audit," she said, "will be submitted to the Training Command Inspector's office today. Standard compliance routing." She looked at Maya. "It will have timestamps showing when each page was compiled. The version log is attached as supporting documentation." A pause. "Per protocol, the inspector's office will have 72 hours to respond before escalation is mandatory." 72 hours, Maya said. "The final qualification exercise is in 48. Nobody said anything for a moment. "Then it needs to go directly to Harlow," Kowalski said. "Not through the standard routing queue. I can't direct route to a lieutenant colonel without cause." "The cause is in that folder," he said. Delgado looked at the folder, looked at the window. The sky had started its preliminary lightening, that first almost imperceptible shift from black to a very deep gray that happened before anyone was ready for it. "I'll submit it through standard routing," she said, "with an urgency classification of Alpha 2, which requires same-day acknowledgement from the receiving officer." She closed the folder. "Lieutenant Colonel Harlow is the designated receiving officer for Alpha 2 compliance submissions in this training command." Maya nodded once. "Go to your range," Delgado said. "Both of you. Be where you're supposed to be." She picked up her pen. "And shoot well." The morning range session ran from 0800 to 2000, and Maya spent every minute of it performing at the level she was actually capable of performing at, because the situation had moved past the point where holding anything in reserve made strategic sense. The exercise was a multi-distance ladder: 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 800 meters, 3 rounds at each distance, building upward with 2-minute intervals between stations. It was the longest distance work the program had done, and the 800-meter station in particular was beyond what most of the class had encountered in a training environment. At 800 meters, in these wind conditions, the margin for error compressed down to a level where small technique errors produced large target misses. Trigger jerk at 800 meters didn't graze the edge of the scoring ring. It put you off paper entirely. Maya worked through the ladder methodically: 300 clean, 400 clean. At 500, she took an extra second and a half on her third round because the wind did something uncertain between gusts, and she didn't like where the reticle was sitting at the brake. And that second and a half cost her in the time efficiency scoring component, but saved her a round placement she wouldn't have been happy with. 500 clean, 600. 2 in the 10 ring, 1 on the boundary. Acceptable given the crosswind behavior at that distance. 601. 3 rounds. She called them 10, 10, 9. Actual 10, 10. The third one she'd overcorrected on the wind change and pulled it into the 9 ring at the 7 o'clock position. Called accurately. Good. 800 meters. Garrett came and stood behind her lane for the 800-meter station. She was aware of him the way she was always aware of him, as a presence that occupied space in her peripheral field without her giving it direct attention. She heard him shift his weight. She heard him uncap his pen. She settled into the position she'd built carefully over the past 15 minutes. Rear bag adjusted for the slight uphill angle. Front rest position to allow a natural point of aim without muscling the rifle. Cheek weld consistent, eye relief identical to every shot she'd fired at shorter distances. She looked through the scope and found the target, a small dark rectangle at 800 meters that the scope brought into clarity, the scoring rings visible but demanding. Wind at 800. She'd been reading it for the past 20 minutes, running left to right, variable between 12 and 17 miles per hour, with a pattern that, if she'd read it correctly, ran a 7-second cycle between gust peaks. She'd timed 3 cycles, consistent enough to work with. She waited. The wind built, peaked. She felt it against the left side of her face. She waited for the trailing edge. The gust died. She broke the shot. The target at 800 meters was a long way away. Even through the scope, calling an 800-meter hit precisely required either a trained spotter or significant experience reading impacts. She had no spotter. She called it 10 ring, left of center. She breathed twice and set up for the second round. Same process. Same cycle timing. She was 2 seconds late on the trigger. She felt it, felt the gust returning before the shot broke and made a micro-adjustment to her hold, and shot anyway. Called it 9 ring, high, third round. The wind cycle had shifted slightly. The interval between peaks was compressing, which sometimes happened as a weather system built. She adjusted her timing to 6 seconds, waited, shot, called it 10 ring. She cleared the rifle and came off the scope, and Garrett was still behind her, pen uncapped, clipboard at his side. She heard him write. 2, 3 marks. Then silence. She did not look at him. She broke down her position and moved to the staging area and waited for the range to go cold. When they walked down range to check targets, she paced the distance at the 800-meter point and looked at her group. 3 rounds. The first one was exactly where she'd called it, 10 ring, left of center, maybe a millimeter outside the X. The second, 9 ring, high, called accurately. The third was in the 10 ring as she'd called it, but slightly more centered than she'd expected, meaning her wind adjustment in the final second had been correct. 46 out of 50 for the 800-meter station alone, if scored accurately. That was an expert-level group at this distance under these conditions. She photographed the target with the disposable camera she'd bought at the post exchange 2 days ago, a choice she'd made after sitting in front of the 31 on the whiteboard, and pocketed the camera. Behind her, she heard Kowalski say quietly, "Good group." "It's all right," she said. "It's exceptional, and you know it." She didn't answer that. She turned and walked back to the firing line. At 11:45, with 15 minutes left in the morning session, Garrett called a halt to the ladder exercise and addressed the class. "Final qualification exercise," he said. "Tomorrow, 0700. Full dress, full kit. The exercise will run the complete qualification protocol. Field movement, unknown distance ranging, unsupported position, and a final time string at distances up to your personal maximum demonstrated range." He looked at the group. "Your performance tomorrow constitutes 60% of your total course score. The remainder has already been calculated." He paused. "Questions?" No questions. Dismissed for the noon break. Range resumes at 1400 for the afternoon prep session. Attendance is mandatory. The class dispersed. Maya picked up her kit and started toward the equipment return, and Garrett said, "Blackwood." She stopped, turned. The other candidates moved away. Within 30 seconds, it was just the two of them on the range, the wind working across the open ground between them, the target frames at the far end standing empty. Garrett looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face. Not quite calculation, not quite discomfort. Something between them. "Tomorrow," he said. "I want to see what you actually shoot." She held his gaze. "You've been seeing it every day." The muscle at the corner of his jaw moved. "The qualification exercise is supervised by external evaluators from the training command. Program cadre scores are reviewed and countersigned by the presiding officer." He let that sit for a second. "Lieutenant Colonel Harlow will be present." She didn't react. She kept her face exactly where it was. "I see," she said. "The exercise will be scored as shot," he said. "Every round, every position." He looked at her for one more beat, then picked up his clipboard and walked toward the range building without looking back. She stood on the empty range and breathed, scored as shot. Delgado's submission had reached him, or reached Harlow, or both. Something in the last 4 hours had changed the calculation in a way that she hadn't fully anticipated. Not the change itself, she'd been working towards some version of this, but the speed of it, the directness of it, and the fact that Garrett had come to her rather than waited. That meant he knew the version log was compromised. That meant someone had told him. And if someone had told him, and he was responding by warning her that tomorrow would be clean, that meant he was calculating his own position, trying to get in front of it, and the cleanest path forward for him was a qualification exercise that produced results nobody could dispute, which meant tomorrow was real. She looked down the range at the 800-meter target frames in the distance. Tomorrow was real, and she was going to have to shoot the best qualification round of her life in front of a lieutenant colonel who had her file in a room full of people who had spent 4 weeks deciding she wasn't supposed to be here. She breathed. She could do that. The knee was manageable. Her rifle was zeroed. She knew these wind conditions well enough to work with them. She'd been building toward this for 22 days. She picked up her kit and walked back toward the building. The afternoon prep session was 3 hours of position work, dry fire and live fire mixed, candidates working through their individual setups with the guidance of whichever instructor they'd been assigned. Maya's assigned instructor for the prep session was a sergeant first class named Okafor, who had been one of the program's quieter presences, technically skilled, not particularly invested in the social dynamics, the kind of instructor who taught because he was good at it, rather than because the job gave him power. Okafor watched her set up and said, "Rear bags high." She looked at the bag. He was right. She'd gotten used to a slightly elevated position over the past week, and it had crept into her default setup. "Good catch," she said, and adjusted it. "Wind's going to run heavier tomorrow than today," he said, reading a printout from the range weather terminal. "Front moving through overnight. Figure 15 to 25, gusting." "Which direction?" "Same west-southwest, but it's going to back towards south by mid-morning." A backing wind meant the correction would shift as the session progressed. Most candidates would dial in their correction at the start of the exercise and hold it static. A backing wind punished that approach. "I'll read it in real time," she said. "That's the only way," he said, and walked to the next lane. At 15:30, while the prep session was still running, a vehicle arrived at the range facility entrance. A staff car with command plates. Maya noted it from the firing position without turning her head, tracking it in her peripheral vision. It stopped at the administration building, not the range. 2 figures got out. She couldn't make the rank from this distance without optics, but the bearing of the taller one was familiar. Harlow. He was a day early. She turned back to her target and broke a dry fire trigger pull, checked her position, adjusted her breathing, shot another dry round. Kowalski was 2 lanes over, and she knew he'd seen the same vehicle because when she glanced over, he was looking at the administration building with the compressed expression of someone processing new information. She looked away. Whatever was happening in the administration building right now was Delgado's territory. Maya's territory was this firing position, this wind, this rifle. She ran 5 more dry fire repetitions and called each one, clean, clean. A slight cant on the 3rd one she caught and corrected before the trigger broke. Clean, clean. At 17:15, the prep session ended. At 17:30, Garrett appeared at the range building and told the class the morning schedule had been moved to 0630 instead of 0700. External evaluators would be on site from 0600. Mandatory formation at 0615. He said this without elaboration and dismissed them. In the barracks that evening, Maya sat on her bunk and cleaned her rifle by feel in the dark. She'd learned to do it that way years ago, because the day might come when you needed to clear a jam or reassemble after a malfunction without light, and the hands needed to know the weapon the way they knew their own geometry. She ran the bore brush, the carbon scraper on the bolt face, the lightly oiled patch through the barrel. She checked the scope mounting screws with a torque wrench she'd borrowed from the armorer. She verified the 0 mark she'd scribed on the elevation turret with a paint pen. Kowalski knocked on the doorframe. She could see his silhouette against the dim corridor light. "Harlow's still in the admin building," he said. "Light's been on for 4 hours." "I know." "Delgado's in there too." She set the rifle down on the cleaning mat. "Are you nervous?" A pause. "A little. You?" She thought about that honestly. There was something in her chest that she identified as anticipatory tension, the same sensation that came in the seconds before the range went hot. when everything that could be prepared had been prepared, and the only thing left was to execute. Not quite fear, not quite calm. The exact position between the two where the good shots lived. "I'm ready," she said. "That's not the same thing as not nervous." "No," she said. "It's not." He was quiet a moment. "Okafor told me your prep session looked sharp. Okafor's a good instructor. He said you're the best shot in this class." A pause. "He said he's known it since week 2. She picked up the oil-patched cloth and ran it along the exterior of the barrel. "Why didn't he say anything?" she asked. "He said it wasn't his call to make." Kowalski shifted against the doorframe. "I've been thinking about that. What that means, that there are people here who've known this whole time and kept their mouths shut because it wasn't their call." She didn't have a response to that. Some things you couldn't fix retroactively. You could only decide what to do with the situation as it currently stood. "Get some sleep," she said. "You need to shoot well tomorrow, too." "I know." He straightened. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you're still here." He left. She finished cleaning the rifle, reassembled it in the dark, and lay down without changing out of her uniform. She slept 4 hours. Dreamless this time. The final qualification day arrived under a sky that had not decided what it wanted to be. Formation was in the cold. The candidates standing in a line outside the range building while the darkness finished leaving and the first gray light worked its way along the western tree line. The air smelled like incoming weather, that particular electrical quality that came before a front moved through, the kind of morning that made every exposed surface feel slightly more present than usual. Maya stood in the line and breathed through her nose and felt the wind against the left side of her face. South-southwest, maybe 12 miles an hour. Not as heavy as Okafor had forecast. Yet. Harlow arrived at the range building at 0622, accompanied by 2 officers Maya didn't recognize, a major and a captain, both from the training command by their insignia. He walked the formation line without speaking, reviewing faces and nameplates, and he stopped in front of Maya for exactly 2 seconds. No expression. He moved on. Garrett stood at the side of the formation with his hands clasped behind his back, watching. At 0630, Harlow stood in front of the class and spoke. "Today's qualification exercise will be conducted under external evaluation protocol," he said. "All scoring will be performed by the evaluation team. Program cadre will observe but will not record or report scores. All targets will be photographed before and after each string by the evaluation team. Results will be recorded directly to the training command database, bypassing the program's internal system." He paused. "Any questions about this process should be directed to me personally, not to program cadre. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," the class said. Harlow looked at Garrett. Garrett's face was a controlled surface that revealed nothing at all. "Let's begin," Harlow said. The qualification exercise opened with the field movement phase, the same type of terrain navigation they'd practiced in week 3, with hide selection and unknown distance ranging to designated targets. The evaluation team split into pairs and followed individual candidates through the field movement, recording everything. Maya's evaluator was the major, a quiet, methodical woman who wore the crossed rifles of an infantry officer and moved through terrain with the efficiency of someone who had spent time in bad places. Maya ranged her first target, 380 meters, slight quartering tailwind, target at a slight depression in the ground that created a false angle on the optic if you didn't account for the horizontal distance component. She ranged it, worked the geometry, and shot, center mass. The major made a mark on her tablet. Second target, 520 meters. The wind had shifted toward south in the time since the exercise started. It had moved faster than Okafor's forecast, which meant it would continue backing. She adjusted, shot, good hit. Third target, it had moved faster than Okafor's forecast, which meant it would continue backing. She adjusted, shot, good hit. Third target, the long one. She estimated 740 meters from the hide, but when she ranged it precisely, the return came back at 762. She corrected. She read the wind at the mid-range point. The vegetation in the draw confirmed the backing shift had continued, now running more from the south-southeast. She held the correction she'd have used for south wind, split the difference, and broke the shot at the trailing edge of a gust. The target fell. The major made a mark and said nothing. Maya broke down her hide and moved to the extraction point. The final time string was run in the afternoon, after the field movement scores had been recorded and the class had a 1-hour break. It was the same ladder structure as the day before, distance increments up to the candidate's personal demonstrated maximum, but run under evaluation protocol with external scoring at each distance. The wind by 1400 was running heavy. It had backed fully to south-southeast and the speed had built. Maya clocked it at 18 miles per hour sustained when she set up her position, with gust spikes she estimated at 25. It was the worst shooting conditions the program had produced in the entire 6 weeks. Most of the class would struggle above 500 meters in this wind. A few would push to 600. The data from the previous day's ladder gave Harlow's evaluation team a comparative benchmark for each candidate's capability, which meant that the afternoon time string would be judged not only on absolute performance, but on relative performance versus demonstrated prior capability. Maya's prior demonstrated capability included the 800-meter group from the morning session. With the external evaluation protocol in place, that performance was now in Harlow's database, attached to her name, scored accurately. She set up on lane 8 one last time. The evaluating major stood 2 meters behind her position. The range went hot. She ran the ladder the way she'd run every string of this program, methodically, without hurrying, reading every condition and adjusting in real time. 300 clean, 400 clean, 500. The wind spiked between her second and third round, and she held off for 11 seconds before breaking the third shot, which cost her in time efficiency, but put the round where it needed to go. 3 in the 10 ring, 600. 2 10 ring, 1 9 ring due to a backing shift she read correctly, but overcorrected by half a minute. She accepted it, 601. The wind was a problem here. The sustained 18 was manageable, but the gust spikes were irregular, and she'd timed one cycle in half of a second before concluding the gust pattern wasn't consistent enough to rely on. She adjusted to a different strategy. Shoot at the moment the wind dropped from its peak rather than at the lull, accepting a reduced pressure environment rather than waiting for calm that wasn't coming. 2 10 ring, 1 9 ring, 800 meters. The range went briefly quiet, while not quiet. The wind never fully stopped, but there was a compressed attention in the air around the range that she registered without consciously noting it. She breathed, found the position, checked her natural point of aim, shifted the rear bag 2 millimeters right to bring it true. Settled her cheek weld. Let her eyes relax on the reticle until the crosshairs were clear and the target was the sharpest thing in the field. She read the wind for 90 seconds before the clock started. The clock started. She watched the vegetation in the draw at the mid-range point, watched the flag at the range boundary, watched the mirage shimmer at the 3/4 distance point that told her what the air was doing in the last section the bullet would travel. South-southeast. 18 sustained, 22 gusting on approximately 12-second intervals. She needed to split the gust peaks and shoot at the trailing edge when the sustained wind was doing most of the work and the gust energy was dissipating. She found the window. She broke the shot. 800 meters. The round traveled for just over a second before impact. She watched through the scope. The target showed the hit indicator, a white plate at the base that dropped when the target was struck in the scoring zone. It dropped. She reloaded. Second round. The wind spiked before she was ready. She held. 12 seconds. The spike passed. She shot on the trailing edge. The plate dropped. Third round. The wind did something she hadn't seen it do all day. It momentarily stilled, a genuine 2-second pause, as if the front was taking a breath before the next push. She felt it on her face, felt the flag at the range boundary droop, felt the mirage shimmer flatten. She was already 2 pounds into the trigger. She held the remaining pressure steady. The wind stayed still. She shot. The plate dropped. 3 for 3 at 800 meters in an 18 to 25 mile-per-hour variable wind. She cleared the weapon and came off the scope. The major behind her wasn't writing on her tablet. She was standing completely still, looking downrange at the target at 800 meters, and something in her posture had changed, an almost imperceptible shift in the quality of her attention, the difference between observing and witnessing. Then she looked down at her tablet and made her marks. Maya picked up her brass from the mat, 3 casings, copper and warm from the chamber, and set them in a line on the bench beside her position, a habit her grandmother had given her. You kept your brass. Every shot was accountable. The range went cold. In the silence that followed, before anyone spoke, before the class began moving downrange to check targets, she heard the wind change direction again, a final small shift back toward west, as if the front had made its point and was now moving through the other side. She sat on the bench behind her position and waited. Around her, the qualification day was ending. She could hear the evaluation team moving, tablets recording, the distant sound of vehicles on the range road. She heard Kowalski's voice somewhere to her left saying something she couldn't make out, and another voice answering. She heard Garrett, at the far end of the range, quiet for once, saying nothing at all. The brass sat in its line beside her. 3 casings? Accountable? Exact. She looked at them for a moment, and then she looked down the range at 800 meters of open ground. And she thought about her grandmother's name in a folder that classified her achievements as invisible. And she thought about Torres packing his gear in the dark. And she thought about Delgado's hands completely steady on a folder full of things that were going to be very loud when they finally opened. She thought about all of it, and then she looked up at the sky. The front clearing now, the cloud ceiling lifting, the western tree line starting to catch the first light of the late afternoon breaking through. And she breathed slowly all the way out. The longest breath she'd taken in 6 weeks. The results came out at 18:30, not on the whiteboard, not through Garrett. Harlow posted them himself, directly to the Training Command database, and had printed copies delivered to the Range Building Administration desk by the captain from his evaluation team. The class gathered in the range building the way people gather when they know something has shifted but haven't yet been told how far. Maya sat on a bench near the back and waited. Harlow stood at the front of the room with the printed results in his hand and read them in order of final score, highest to lowest, the way qualification results were supposed to be read, without commentary, without editorial, just the name and the number and the rank it earned. Blackwood, Maya A., Private First Class, final composite score, 271 out of 300, distinguished qualification. The room went very quiet. Not surprised quiet, stunned quiet. The particular silence of people recalibrating something they thought they'd already understood. Prentice scored 258, Breck 251, Kowalski 244. The rest of the class descended from there. Maya had the highest score in the cycle. She sat on her bench and looked at the floor and breathed slowly through the noise that came up in her chest. Not triumph, not quite. Something older and more complicated than triumph. Something that felt like a door opening that had been locked for a very long time, and the opening of it letting in both light and cold air at the same moment. Harlow finished reading the list and set the paper down. Effective immediately, he said. The Advanced Precision Course scoring system is under administrative review. All results from this cycle are final and will not be subject to program-level modification. All results from the previous 3 cycles will be re-examined by the Training Command Inspector's Office. He looked at the room. Class is dismissed for the evening. Formal debrief 0800 tomorrow in the administration conference room. Attendance mandatory for all candidates and program cadre. He picked up his papers and left. The room stayed quiet for another 3 seconds after the door closed. Then Kowalski, from somewhere to Maya's left, said, 271. She didn't respond. Out of 300, he said. I heard the number. That's the highest score this program has posted in... He stopped. I don't actually know how long, but it's a long time. She stood up and picked up her jacket. Blackwood. Prentice's voice from across the room. She turned. He was standing with his arms at his sides, his expression doing something complicated. The specific facial work of a genuinely competitive person encountering a result they can't rationalize away. The 800-meter string, he said. 3 for 3 in that wind. Yes. How? She looked at him for a moment. Read the wind. Shoot at the right time. That's not... He stopped himself. Tried again. I've been shooting competitively for 6 years. I've never shot 3 for 3 at 800 in a 20-mile-per-hour crosswind. The wind back to south-southeast, she said. It was 18 sustained, not 20, and I waited for the gust cycle. He looked at her like she'd said something in a language he recognized but hadn't fully learned. Where did you learn to do that? He said. She thought about her grandmother, about a kitchen table and a car ride, and the way fragments of a story came sideways when they came at all. Family, she said, and left. She didn't sleep again that night. Not for lack of trying. She lay down at 2100 and stayed horizontal until 0400. But the ceiling above her bunk was too present, and her mind kept running the day's strings in involuntary review. The hold points, the wind calls, the quarter-second decisions that had gone right, and the ones she'd had to manage. Her knee was aching in the way it ached after a hard physical day. Not sharp, just present, a low, sustained reminder that her body had limits and had been working against them. At 0430, she gave up and got dressed and went to the range. It was empty and dark, the overhead lights off, the target frames standing at their distances in the gray, pre-dawn nothing. She sat in a chair at the head of the firing line and looked down the range at 800 meters of open ground and thought about what the debrief at 0800 was going to look like. She'd been through debrief situations before, not this specific kind, but situations where facts had been established that contradicted what someone with authority had been saying, and the process of working through that contradiction in a formal setting had a particular character. People didn't typically become honest all at once. They moved in stages: initial defense, selective acknowledgement, negotiated concession, eventual repositioning. The question was how much of that process Harlow had already completed on his side, and where Garrett currently sat on that spectrum. The administration building light was on. It had been on when she'd walked past. Either Harlow was working early or Delgado had come in before the sun, which she would not have found surprising. Maya sat in the chair on the dark range and thought about Torres. He'd been out of the program for 8 days. His unit had been notified that he'd been returned from APC selection as insufficiently qualified. That notation was in his personnel file. Whatever the review of previous cycles produced, fixing Torres's file was going to require someone with the authority and the specific institutional will to do it. And those things didn't always arrive at the same time. She made a note in her green notebook. Torres. Full name, dates of the exercises she'd observed his performance in, her parallel scoring data. She'd give it to Harlow's team at the debrief if the opportunity arose. She'd give it to them regardless of whether the opportunity arose naturally. You didn't wait for the right moment, when the right moment might be the only one you got. At 0545, Delgado appeared at the range building door. Maya looked at her. "He wants to see you," Delgado said, "before the debrief." 0630. Harlow. "Yes." Maya closed her notebook. "Is Garrett going to be there?" "No." A pause. "Not yet." Harlow's temporary office was the administration conference room, which he'd appropriated from the program staff the moment he'd arrived. It was a standard military facility room, rectangular, functional, a table with 8 chairs, a whiteboard that still had the ghosts of previous sessions visible in the dried marker residue that never fully wiped clean. He was sitting at the head of the table with a cup of coffee and a folder when Maya came in. The major from the evaluation team was there too, seated to his left with a tablet. "Sit down," Harlow said. She sat. He opened the folder. She could see it was her personnel file, the actual one, not the program's internal documentation. Standard Army records jacket, the kind that followed a soldier from assignment to assignment. Blackwood Maya A, he said. Current MOS 92G, prior MOS 11B, 3 years. Enlisted at 19. He looked at her over the folder. No combat deployments. No. Expert marksmanship badge, M4, 2 qualification cycles. No other formal shooting credentials in your record. He turned a page. Prior to your Army service, any competitive shooting background? Formal training outside the institutional system? Informal, she said. Meaning? She thought about how to say it accurately, not sentimentally, just as information. My grandmother, she said, she spent a significant amount of time teaching me. Positions, wind reading, range estimation, from the time I was 8 or 9. It wasn't formal, no range fees, no competition registration. It was just what we did on weekends. Harlow was quiet for a moment. Your grandmother, he said. Eleanor Blackwood. The name in his voice landed differently than she'd expected. Not like a question, like a recognition. You know who she was, Maya said. I know who she was. He closed the folder slightly. She appears in the training command's historical records in a way that is incomplete. Her evaluations during the period she participated in precursor programs to the modern APC are classified at a level that I've had to request access to through the Inspector General's office. What I've been able to read indicates a level of capability that was, at the time, documented, but not formally acknowledged. He looked at her steadily. The program she participated in didn't qualify women. She was there as part of an evaluation study that was never published. Maya kept her face where it was. She never told me that specifically, she said. No, I imagine she wouldn't have. He set the folder down. What she would have known is that the results existed somewhere, even if they were invisible, and apparently she made sure the capability transferred. The major beside him was making quiet notes on her tablet. I need to ask you something directly, Harlow said. All right. The documentation you and Corporal Kowalski provided to the civilian logistics coordinator, the parallel scoring log, the version log discrepancies, the whiteboard comparison. Did you begin compiling that documentation with the intent to file a formal complaint, or was it initially self-protective? She thought about that. The honest answer was that it had been both at different stages, and the order had mattered. Initially self-protective, she said. I noticed the discrepancy on day 7. I started logging because I needed to understand whether I was misreading my own performance or whether the scores were being modified. Once I established the pattern was real, the documentation became something else. Something else. Evidence, she said. He nodded slowly. The version log review is going to take several weeks to complete formally. The previous cycle records will require individual review of each affected candidate's file. He paused. 9 candidates over 3 cycles, that we know of so far. Torres, she said. We're aware of Torres. He was performing above the elimination threshold. His scores were adjusted below it. I know. Something moved in Harlow's face, not a significant expression, but a tightening around the eyes that was the controlled version of a harder reaction. We're locating him. He has a right to know what happened to his file. He does. And he will. Harlow looked at his coffee for a moment. You understand that the formal review process will take time that neither of us fully controls. The institutional machinery moves at its own pace. I understand. And that your score stands as posted, 271, distinguished qualification. I understand that too. He looked at her. Is there anything else you want to tell me before the 0800 debrief? She reached into her breast pocket and pulled out the green notebook. She'd flagged the relevant pages with small torn paper markers. She set it on the table and pushed it toward him. Torres's observable performance data from weeks 2 and 3, she said. My parallel log entries for every scored exercise. The day 14 whiteboard comparison. She paused. The camera's in my bunk. Disposable, 12 frames exposed. Target photographs from the past 3 days. I can have it to you before the debrief. Harlow looked at the notebook, then at her. The camera, he said, in case the scoring system records were changed before the version log could be pulled. I wanted physical documentation of the targets independent of any digital record. He was quiet for a moment. How long have you been preparing for this? He said. Since day 7, she said, when I knew it was real. He picked up the notebook. He didn't open it. He just held it, with the particular care of someone who understood what it represented. 3 weeks of a woman doing the institutional machinery's job for it, in a program that was using the machinery against her. 0800, he said. Conference room. Bring the camera. She stood and left. The 0800 debrief was the most controlled tension she had experienced since arriving at Fort Carver. The conference room held all 16 candidates, minus Torres, who was absent in a way that was itself a statement, plus Garrett, his 2 assistant instructors, Harlow, the major and captain from the evaluation team, and Delgado, who sat in a chair along the wall with a folder in her lap and the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to be in this particular room. Harlow opened the debrief without preamble. This session covers 3 items, he said. 1. Final qualification results and assignment implications. 2. Administrative review findings and immediate program adjustments. 3. Process going forward. He looked at the room. We'll take them in order. The final results were the same as posted the night before, and Harlow read them again for the record. When he read Maya's name and score, she heard the quality of silence in the room change slightly. Not dramatically, but in the way that rooms change when something has been confirmed that some people hoped might still be negotiable. Garrett sat at the far end of the table. His posture was the same posture he'd maintained for 6 weeks, controlled, upright, invested in presenting no surface that could be read. But his hands were flat on the table in front of him, and Maya noticed they weren't moving. Usually, he had a pen. Item 2, Harlow said, administrative review. He didn't look at Garrett when he said it. He looked at the table in the middle of the room, at the neutral space between the two sides, and spoke carefully and clearly. The Training Command's compliance review of this cycle's scoring records has identified systematic discrepancies between original tablet entries and posted scores across multiple scored exercises. These discrepancies demonstrate a consistent directional bias affecting specific candidates. The digital version log, which maintains a complete record of all modifications to the scoring system, has been secured by the Inspector General's office as of 0200 this morning. He paused. Review of records from previous cycles is ongoing. No one in the room spoke. The program's internal scoring protocol is suspended effective immediately, Harlow continued. All scoring for future cycles will be conducted by external evaluation personnel under Training Command oversight, with results posted directly to the command database without program-level review. He set his paper down. This change is permanent, pending the formal review outcome. The assistant instructor to Garrett's left, a staff sergeant named Kellner, who Maya had assessed from week 1 as the weaker of the two, the one who followed rather than decided, shifted in his chair and said, "Sir, the scoring adjustments were—" "Kellner," Garrett said. One word, flat. Kellner stopped. Harlow looked at Garrett. Garrett looked back at him with the careful, empty expression of a man who had calculated the exact parameters of his situation and was operating within them. "Staff Sergeant Garrett," Harlow said, "you're aware of your rights regarding the formal review process." "Yes, sir." "Do you have anything to say regarding the findings at this stage?" "A beat. 2 beats. The program was designed to produce the best qualified shooters for advanced assignment," Garrett said. "My judgment regarding candidate selection was based on an assessment of overall capability, not individual exercise scores alone." "Your judgment," Harlow said, "was applied to the scoring records in a way that constitutes falsification of official military documentation. That finding is not a matter of interpretation. It's in the version log." He held Garrett's gaze for a moment. "We can discuss the specifics of your judgment in a separate proceeding." Garrett said nothing. Kowalski, from across the table, made a sound that was not quite a word. Maya looked at him. He caught himself and went still. "Item 3, Harlow said, turning back to the class. "Process going forward." What followed over the next 40 minutes was the slow, structured work of institutional correction, which was not dramatic and not clean and not anything like a resolution, because resolution implied completion, and completion implied that the process was finished. The process was not finished. It had barely started. Harlow outlined the review timeline. The Inspector General's office would work through the version log records from the previous 3 cycles over the following 6 weeks. Affected candidates from previous cycles would be notified through their current chain of command and given the opportunity to have their files reviewed and, where appropriate, corrected. The formal proceedings against program cadre would run on a parallel track under the military justice system, separate from the administrative review, with timelines that Harlow was careful to describe as independent of anything anyone in this room would control. 3 candidates from this cycle, Torres and 2 others, who had been placed on administrative warning status in weeks 2 and 3, were being recalled for a supplemental evaluation. Their original separation or warning notations were being suspended pending the review. Maya listened to all of it. She watched Garrett at the far end of the table, who listened too, with a face that gave away nothing but whose stillness was its own communication. The stillness of a man who had spent years in a position of authority over a system he controlled, and who was now in the process of understanding that the system had outgrown his control while he wasn't watching. After Harlow finished, he opened the floor briefly for questions. Prentice raised his hand. "Sir, the candidates from this cycle who qualified, our assignments, are those affected by the review?" "No," Harlow said. "Your qualification results are posted and final. Assignment recommendations will proceed as normal through your respective chains of command." Prentice nodded and put his hand down. He looked at Maya across the table with the same expression he'd had the night before. Complicated, specific, not quite resolved. Breck said, "What happens to the program? As a program?" "It continues," Harlow said, "under new oversight protocols. The APC is a necessary program. What happened here was a failure of the people running it, not of the program's purpose." The room absorbed that. Kowalski looked at Maya. She looked back at him. There wasn't much to say with a look, but what they exchanged in that second was enough. The particular acknowledgement of two people who had stood on the same side of something difficult and come out the other end with the result they'd aimed at, without being able to fully celebrate it yet because the full cost hadn't finished being calculated. Harlow closed the debrief at 0914. He dismissed the candidates and asked Cadre to remain. As Maya filed toward the door, he said, "Blackwood, a moment." She stepped aside while the room emptied. Garrett remained at the far end of the table, and the two instructors. Harlow waited until the door closed behind the last candidate. Then he said, to the room, "Before we proceed to the cadre portion of this review, I want to address something directly." He looked at Garrett. "Staff Sergeant, you had an expert-level shooter in this program for 6 weeks. You identified her capability. I've seen your internal notes, and they're accurate. You knew what she was." Garrett said nothing. "And you chose to spend that 6 weeks suppressing it rather than developing it," Harlow said. "I want to understand the reasoning behind that decision." The silence in the room was a different quality of silence from what had come before. Garrett looked at the table, then at Harlow. His jaw worked slightly. "The program has standards," he said, "criteria beyond individual shooting performance, unit cohesion, leadership integration, candidate fit for the operational environment they'd be assigned to." "Candidate fit," Harlow repeated. "Sir?" "That's a determination you made," Harlow said, "and then encoded into falsified scores rather than making it openly and documenting it through the proper evaluation criteria." He waited. "If you had genuine concerns about a candidate's overall suitability beyond shooting performance, there were legitimate processes for documenting and acting on those concerns. You chose not to use them." Garrett's hands remained flat on the table. "The candidate population I was working with," he said carefully, "was selected through a process that I didn't control. My job was to produce qualified personnel within the program's operational needs." "Your job," Harlow said, "was to run a fair selection process. That's what the program exists to do." He picked up his folder. "We'll continue this in the formal proceeding. You're aware of the schedule." Garrett stood. He looked at the table one more time, then at the door, then, briefly, just briefly, at the chair Maya had been sitting in, at the near end of the table, where her green notebook had sat while she pushed it across toward Harlow. He looked at it like he was calculating something, working through how a piece of evidence had come from inside his own program, assembled by a candidate he'd placed at lane 8 in bad light with an unstable scope, and turned into the instrument of his accounting. Then he walked out. Maya was in the parking area outside the administration building when Kowalski found her. The morning had fully arrived now. Actual sun, the front gone, the sky a flat, clean blue, with the wind still running but lighter than it had been, 6 or 7 miles an hour from the northwest, shifting back toward where it had started. "They're pulling Kellner too," Kowalski said. "I heard it from the captain, both instructors." "Kellner knew," she said. "He went along with it." "Yeah." He stood beside her, both of them looking at nothing in particular. "What happens now, for you, assignment-wise?" "I don't know yet. Distinguished qualification opens some options that weren't available before." She thought about it practically, the way she tried to think about most things, in terms of what was actually in front of her, rather than what she wished were in front of her. "I'll find out when I talk to my assignments officer." "My Ranger Battalion has a precision element," he said. "Long-range surveillance and precision fires. They've been looking for shooters who can operate independently." A pause. "In case you're interested in where distinguished APC qualifications sometimes lead." She looked at him. "I'm not recruiting you," he said. "I'm just telling you what I know." "I know you're not recruiting me." "It would be a good use of what you can do," he said, "and they'd actually look at your score." She thought about Torres, about a file that needed correcting, about 9 people over 3 cycles who had their performance invisibly revised downward and then disappeared back into a system that had already decided what to think of them. "I'll look at my options," she said. He nodded. I was quiet for a moment, standing beside her in the parking lot with the northwest wind on both their faces. Your grandmother, he said. Was she ever formally credited for what she did? No, Maya said. Are they going to look at that too, the historical files? Harlow said the records from her evaluation study are classified. He's requesting access through the IG office. She paused. Whether access turns into acknowledgement is a different question. What do you think happens? She looked at the sky, at the clean blue of it, the way it went all the way out past the tree line to the west where the front had gone. I think acknowledgement takes longer than justice, she said, but I think it eventually catches up. Kowalski nodded slowly. She taught you well, he said. She taught me everything, Maya said. The institution just took a while to notice. He laughed. A short, genuine sound, the first real laughter she'd heard from him. She found herself almost smiling, which was not something that happened easily or often. Distinguished qualification, he said. Lane 8. Lane 8, she said. They stood there a moment longer and the wind moved through the parking lot between the buildings, finding its way the way wind always finds its way, around obstacles, through gaps, indifferent to the structures in its path. Then Kowalski's radio crackled with something from the range building, and he excused himself and went, and Maya stood alone in the thin morning sun with her notebook in her pocket and her hands at her sides and the knowledge that the next thing coming was going to be harder than the thing she'd just come through. Because what she'd just come through had at least been contained in a place she could see, with people she could map, on a range where the distances were known, and the wind, however changeable, was something she knew how to read. What came next was going to be larger, institutional. Slow in the specific grinding way that institutional change was slow, full of the kind of friction that didn't announce itself with a name or a rank, but with time and paperwork, and the accumulated resistance of systems that didn't adapt easily to the fact that they'd been wrong. She was going to need the same patience she'd brought to Lane 8, the same stillness, the same careful accounting of what was true versus what was being recorded. She looked at the range building one more time, the concrete block exterior, the faded unit crest above the main door, the sign that said, "Authorized personnel only." In letters that had been weathered and repainted enough times that the edges of each letter were slightly soft. She breathed in. She breathed out. She turned and walked toward the barracks to collect her gear, and behind her the wind moved through the empty parking lot and found nothing worth stopping for. She packed her gear the way she'd arrived, methodically, without ceremony, folding each item with the same attention she gave everything that mattered to her hands. The barracks room was mostly empty. 2 other candidates were packing as well, working in the quiet that comes after something significant has happened, and everyone is still figuring out what to say about it. Nobody said much. That was fine. Maya had never needed much conversation to fill space, and this particular space felt right to leave mostly unfilled, the way you leave a cooling barrel alone because touching it too soon doesn't help anyone. She was rolling her second uniform when her phone buzzed on the bunk beside her. Unknown number. Fort Carver Exchange. She answered. Blackwood. Harlow's voice. Direct, no preamble. My office, 30 minutes. Sir? He hung up. She finished rolling the uniform and set it in the duffel and sat for a moment on the edge of the bunk with her hands on her knees. 30 minutes meant something had moved. Things didn't move on their own in institutional processes. Something had pushed it, or someone had pulled it, and either way, the result was that she was being called back into a room before she'd finished leaving the last one. She put her jacket on and went. Harlow's temporary office had changed in the 2 hours since the debrief. The evaluation team's materials were consolidated into a single case near the door, which meant they were preparing to move. The major was gone. The captain was at the far corner with a laptop, typing with the focused efficiency of someone completing required documentation before a departure window. Harlow was on the phone when Maya came in, and he held up one finger without looking at her, finished a sentence she couldn't fully hear, and set the phone down. Sit, he said. She sat. He opened a different folder this time, not her personnel file. Something from the training command printed on letterhead she didn't recognize immediately. The IG office completed a preliminary review of the historical records this morning, he said. Faster than I expected, which means someone there has been aware of the issue longer than the formal process acknowledges. He looked at her. The records from your grandmother's evaluation period, the study she participated in, classified as a research program in 1971, have been partially declassified under an expedited review order I requested through the command inspector's office yesterday. Maya looked at the folder. What do they show? She said. He turned the folder around and slid it across the desk toward her. She looked. The documents were old, photocopied from originals, the text slightly blurred at the edges from decades of storage, the official headers in a font that belonged to a different era of military administration. Her grandmother's name appeared at the top of the first evaluation form, Blackwood, Eleanor M., designation civilian research participant, program reference 71, arms 4. Below the name, a scoring record. The numbers on that page were not ambiguous. They were not borderline. They were not the documentation of someone who had been present in a program as a research subject without meaningful performance data. Eleanor Blackwood had shot a 283 out of 300 in the 1971 evaluation protocol, a protocol that, by the comparative standards Harlow had annotated in pencil in the margin, was equivalent in structure and distance parameters to the modern APC qualification format. 283. Maya had shot 271. Her grandmother had been better. And the document at the bottom of the stack, the program summary report, filed by the lead research officer in December 1971, contained a single paragraph in the conclusion section that read, in the careful bureaucratic language of institutional understatement, that the female participants' performance data was statistically significant and recommended for further study, and that formal program integration was outside the scope of the current research authorization. Outside the scope. Because the program didn't qualify women, because the institution had looked at a 283 and decided the problem was the authorization, not the score. Maya sat with the folder in her hands and breathed through something that rose in her chest and didn't have a clean name. Grief wasn't quite right, and anger wasn't quite right, and pride wasn't quite right either, though all three of them were somewhere in it. Her grandmother had been 81 years old when she died. She had never once, in Maya's memory, expressed bitterness about what the institution had done with her capability. She had just kept teaching, kept passing it down, kept saying, watch the grass, read the wind, make the shot when the moment comes. She had made her peace with invisibility by making sure the capability didn't stay invisible. She had sent it forward in the only form she could. Maya set the folder down carefully. What happens with this? She said. Her voice was level. The program commander's office is preparing a formal acknowledgement, Harlow said. It won't be a decoration. The program authorization for that period doesn't support retroactive recognition through that channel, and I won't pretend otherwise. What it will be is a documented record correction. Her name, her scores, her evaluation results, entered into the official program history as a participant whose performance met or exceeded qualification standards. He paused. It's not everything she deserved, but it's what the process can actually deliver. It's something, Maya said. It's real, he said, which matters. She looked at the folder one more time, at her grandmother's name at the top of the page, in the slightly smudged typeface of a 1971 military evaluation form that had been sitting in a classified archive for 53 years. She never told me the specific numbers, Maya said. I knew she'd been good. She made that clear through the teaching, but she never gave me the score. Why do you think she didn't? Maya thought about it, about a kitchen table, about a car ride, and the particular sideways way the pieces of the story had always arrived. Because she didn't want me shooting to match a number, she said. She wanted me shooting to hit the target. Harlow was quiet for a moment. That's a good teacher, he said. Yes, Maya said. She was. She was back in the parking lot at 1100, her duffel loaded in the back of the transport van that was running the departing candidates back to the main post. 3 other candidates were already there. Breck, 2 others whose names she'd learned but hadn't spent much time with. They loaded their gear with the specific economy of soldiers who were ready to be somewhere else. Kowalski appeared at 11:15, kit over his shoulder, and threw his bag in beside Maya's with a thud that was louder than necessary. They moved the formal proceedings up, he said. Garrett's been relieved of instructional duties effective this morning. I know, she said. Kellner too. He leaned against the van. Harlow's staying on site for another 72 hours to supervise the transition to the new oversight protocol. A pause. You talked to him again? Yes. He waited. She decided he'd earned the information. My grandmother's evaluation records, she said. They declassified them this morning. She shot a 283 in a 1971 protocol equivalent to the APC qualification format. Kowalski looked at her. Something moved across his face. 283, he said. Yes. And they didn't qualify her, classified the results, filed the study. She kept her voice even. The program didn't qualify women. The score was irrelevant to the decision. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet where a person is working through something they don't have the right words for and knows it. And now? He said. Record correction. Official program history. She picked up her jacket from the van door. It's not nothing. No. He looked across the parking lot toward the range building. It's not nothing. The transport van's engine turned over, and the driver knocked twice on the side panel to signal 5 minutes to departure. Breck climbed in. The two others followed. Kowalski looked at Maya. That element I mentioned, long-range surveillance and precision fires. I know what you mentioned. Are you going to put in for it? She looked at the range building one last time. The concrete exterior, the weathered sign, Lane 8 invisible from here, but present in her body, the way 6 weeks of any particular place embedded itself. I'm going to talk to my assignments officer, she said, and I'm going to ask about Torres first, make sure his file is being corrected and he's being contacted. And after Torres? She threw her jacket in the van and climbed in behind it. After Torres, yes, put in for it. He nodded once and climbed in beside her, and the van doors closed, and Fort Carver's Advanced Precision Course facility moved past the windows and then fell behind them and was gone. Well, Torres was located 11 days later. He'd returned to his unit, a light infantry company at a post 3 states away, and resumed normal duties without explanation, because that was how it worked. You came back from a selection program having failed, and your unit accepted that as the story, because the documentation said it was the story. And you went back to doing your job because the alternative was allowing the failure to define you. And soldiers who were any good at being soldiers didn't let that happen. He was in the middle of a maintenance detail on a vehicle when his company commander called him into the office and told him he was receiving a call from a lieutenant colonel at the training command. The call lasted 22 minutes. Maya knew this because Torres called her afterward, which she hadn't expected. She hadn't given him her number directly. Kowalski had, apparently, passed it along in the way that information moves through networks of people who have been through something together. They're recalling me, Torres said. His voice had the particular quality of someone who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that the sudden removal of the weight felt less like relief and more like the dizzying realization of how much they'd been carrying. I know, she said. Supplemental evaluation. 2 weeks from now. A pause. They said my original scores were altered, that the official record didn't match the documented exercise data. Yes. By how much? She thought about the numbers she'd written in her notebook. His numbers, beside hers. Enough, she said. Enough that it changes the outcome. He was quiet for a moment. Did you... He stopped. Was this you? The documentation. It was documented, she said carefully. That's what mattered. Another silence. I thought I wasn't good enough, he said. I went back to my unit thinking I wasn't good enough. 11 days of that. She didn't say anything immediately because there wasn't a response to that which made it better, and false comfort was worse than silence. So she let the silence be what it was. You were good enough, she said finally. You were always good enough. The system was the problem, not your shooting. The grass in the draw, he said. Field exercise, week 3. You told me to watch the grass. Yes. I've been doing that. A pause, and something almost like a laugh in it. At the range back here, just on my own time. I've been watching the grass. Good, she said. Thank you, he said, for whatever it is you did. Do well on the supplemental eval, she said. I will, he said, and she believed him. Well, the formal proceedings against Garrett concluded 6 weeks after the qualification exercise, which was faster than Maya had expected and slower than she'd hoped, which was about the usual ratio for institutional accountability. The findings were specific and documented. Falsification of official training records across 4 program cycles, resulting in the wrongful elimination or suppression of 12 candidates whose performance data had been altered. The number had grown from 9 as the IG review progressed through the version logs. 12 people. 12 files. Garrett received a reduction in rank and was reassigned to an administrative post outside the training community with a notation in his record that was, functionally, the end of any meaningful career trajectory. He did not appeal. She hadn't expected him to. Men like Garrett understood the mechanics of institutional consequence well enough to know when the calculation was settled. Kellner received a letter of reprimand and a reassignment. The other instructor, the quieter one, a sergeant first class who Maya had assessed from the start as someone going along rather than driving the decision, received administrative counseling and remained in a reduced role during a supervised transition period. She thought that was probably about right, as much as these things ever were. The APC program reopened for its next cycle under the new external evaluation protocol 3 months after Maya's cycle ended. Harlow's office released a statement through the Training Command's Public Affairs branch noting programmatic improvements to scoring transparency and oversight. It didn't mention what had necessitated the improvements. These things rarely did. Maya read the statement on her phone in the passenger seat of a government vehicle moving along a highway in the flatlands of a state she hadn't spent much time in before, on the way to an assignment that was nothing like running a kitchen. The long-range surveillance and precision fires element of the Ranger Battalion was housed in a low building at the edge of a training complex that had the specific institutional plainness of a place where the work was the point and everything else was incidental. No unit crest above the door, no display cases in the hallway. A whiteboard inside the entrance with range schedules written in dry erase, and a coffee maker that had clearly been through a significant number of operational rotations. The element's senior NCO was a master sergeant named Vreeland, who was 43 years old, had the build of someone who had spent 2 decades carrying heavy things over difficult terrain, and who looked at Maya's file for approximately 90 seconds when she arrived before setting it down and saying, 271 and APC distinguished. Yes. The evaluation team's report says you shot 3 for 3 at 800 in an 18-plus crosswind, 18 to 22, backing towards south through the exercise. Called your own wind. No spotter available. He looked at her for a moment. Not assessingly. She'd had enough of that particular look for a while. More like someone recalibrating the order of the introduction they'd planned to give. We work in 2-man teams, he said. Shooter and spotter. Occasionally solo in environments where a 2-man signature isn't survivable. Distances range from 400 to over 1,000 meters, depending on mission parameters. He picked up a coffee cup that needed washing and held it without drinking from it. You'll start as spotter. Everyone starts as spotter. Understood. Good shooters make bad spotters sometimes because they can't turn off the shooting instinct long enough to read the environment. You think that's going to be a problem for you? She thought about 6 weeks of watching Kowalski's groups, reading Torres's wind calls, tracking the behavior of the air in the draw at the field exercise's third hide. No, she said. We'll find out, he said. Not unkindly. You got a place to stay while the housing assignment processes? I have a hotel receipt and a per diem authorization. Better than nothing. He stood up and picked his field jacket off the back of his chair. Come on, I'll show you the range. She followed him out into the afternoon. The sky here was wider than at Fort Carver. Flat terrain, the horizon running clean and uninterrupted in every direction. The kind of landscape that made distance feel more honest than when it was broken by trees and ridges. The wind was running from the west at about 10 miles per hour. Steady, no gusting. The kind of clean, uncomplicated wind that was almost relaxing after 6 weeks of variable conditions. She noted it automatically. A habit now. Maybe always had been a habit. She just paid more attention to the fact of it. The range extended from the building in a long, unbroken corridor to the west. Target frames visible at intervals she read as 300, 500, 700, and a final frame she estimated at around 950 meters. 950? She said. Vreeland looked at her. 980. Give or take. Give or take. Wine's honest here, he said. Flat terrain. What you see is what you get. No thermal complications, no ridge effects. A pause. Gets boring after a while. I won't find it boring, she said. He looked at her sideways. Almost a smile, though he kept it close to his chest. No, he said. I don't imagine you will. The record correction for Eleanor Blackwood appeared in the Advanced Precision Course's official program history. 14 weeks after Maya's qualification exercise. It was one paragraph. Name, dates, program reference, scores. A notation that the participant's performance had met qualification standards under the applicable protocol, and that this achievement was entered into the official record as part of a program history correction authorized by the Training Command Inspector's Office. One paragraph. After 53 years. Maya read it on her phone at 0530, sitting in the dark outside the range building before the day's training started, her coffee going cold beside her because she'd forgotten to drink it. She read it twice. Then she put the phone away and picked up her coffee and drank it cold without noticing. She thought about how she'd try to explain this to someone who hadn't lived adjacent to it, how she'd describe the particular thing it felt like to see a name in an official document that had been officially invisible for half a century. She didn't have a clean way to explain it. The language for it existed, probably. There were words for institutional recognition and posthumous acknowledgement and the specific weight of a wrong finally named. But those words felt too large and too clean for the actual thing, which was messier and smaller and more human than any of them. What she felt, sitting in the dark with her cold coffee and her grandmother's name on a phone screen, was something like, now she is in the record that had refused her, the record that had classified her score and archived her capability and filed the whole thing under Research Program 71 Arms 4, as if she were a data point rather than a person. That same record now had her name in it as a participant whose performance had been exceptional, and the word exceptional was not in the paragraph Harlow's office had written, but the numbers made it say it anyway, because 283 out of 300 in a 1971 qualification protocol said what it said regardless of the language around it. One paragraph. 14 weeks. 53 years. Not enough. And also something. She sat with that for a while. Let it be complicated. Let it be what it actually was rather than what would be easier to feel. When the sky started its preliminary lightning and the first activity sounds came from the building behind her, she got up and went to work. Torres passed his supplemental evaluation with a score of 237, qualified, solid, unremarkable, in the way that honest competence is sometimes unremarkable when it isn't being suppressed. He was offered a position in a long-range fire support element and took it. He called Maya once more, a short call, mostly to say he'd passed and that he'd been watching the grass in his new unit's training corridor and that it was different from Fort Carver's grass, flatter in its behavior, easier to read. Everything's easier to read on flat terrain, she told him. Is that where you are? For now, she said. How is it? She looked at the range from the doorway of the Elements building, at the target at 980 meters visible at the end of the corridor in the flat afternoon light. Good, she said, and meant it. She had been in the element for 4 months when Vreeland put her on a two-man team as lead shooter for the first time. A training evolution, 2 days in the field, simulated operational environment, real distance, real conditions. Her spotter was a sergeant named Aranda, who had 2 operational deployments and the kind of quiet confidence that came from having had decisions matter in ways that couldn't be undone. On the second day, at 920 meters in a quartering wind, Aranda gave her the wind call and she disagreed with it. I've got it at 12 from 2 o'clock, he said. Hold right, full mill. She was reading the grass in the depression at the mid-range point. The grass said something different. Wind's backing, she said. Watch the vegetation at 700. It's running closer to 1 o'clock. I'm going 3/4 mil. A pause. Your call, he said. She shot 3/4 mil. The target fell. Aranda was quiet for a second. 3/4 mil, he said. 3/4 mil, she confirmed. How'd you read that? The grass, she said. He looked through his spotting scope at the vegetation in the depression at the mid-range point, then at the fallen target. Then he wrote something in his data book. Walk me through it, he said. She did. The element ran a qualification assessment at the 8-month mark for all personnel, a combination of field movement and long-range precision work that reset everyone's performance record within the unit and established a baseline for the coming operational cycle. It was internal, not a program like APC, not a selection event, just the honest work of a unit that needed to know what its people could actually do. Maya shot a 268 out of 300. not her best. Her knee had given her more trouble than usual on the field movement phase. The descent section over rocky terrain had been harder than she'd wanted, and it had cost her some stability in the initial shooting sequence. She'd managed it, kept it inside the margin, but it had been a managed performance in the way that some performances were managed, and she'd known it while it was happening, and that knowledge lived in the score. Vreeland posted the results on the internal board without ceremony. He stopped by her lane afterward while she was breaking down her kit. 268, he said. Yes. Knee? She looked at him. Field movement descent, rocky surface, loaded. He nodded, not offering a comment, not asking her to explain herself, just acknowledging the information. Medical? He said. It's documented. Not a disqualifying condition. I manage it. I know you manage it, he said. I'm asking if you want the medical support to do it better. She thought about that. About the knee sleeve under her trousers that she'd been wearing since week 3 of APC, the adaptation she'd built around an inconvenience she'd decided to treat as a constraint rather than a problem to solve. Yes, she said. I'll make the appointment. Good. He started to move away, stopped. 268 with a compromised field movement phase. Assuming that phase runs clean, what do you shoot? She thought about it honestly. 275, she said. Maybe more. He nodded once and left. She finished breaking down her position and sat for a moment on the bench with her hands on her knees and thought about the number. 275, maybe more. And what it meant that she was still calculating upward, still looking at what the distance between her current performance and her actual capability was, and treating that distance as something to close rather than something to accept. She thought about her grandmother at 81, still teaching, still passing the discipline forward, still finding the next version of the story to tell with her hands and her patience and her clear-eyed assessment of what the wind was actually doing versus what you might wish it were doing. She thought about 283, about a score sitting in a classified folder for 53 years while the woman who shot it kept teaching anyway. Some legacies didn't come with recognition attached. They came with capability attached, with knowledge and patience, and the particular discipline of people who understood that the record would catch up eventually, that the version log of what actually happened always existed somewhere, waiting for someone with the right access and the willingness to look. Maya picked up her rifle, slung it, and walked off the range into the flat afternoon. Behind her, the wind moved through the corridor, 10 miles an hour, honest, west to east, nothing complicated about it. The grass in the distant draw at the mid-range point bent uniformly and without hesitation, reading true to what the air was actually doing, just like she'd been taught. Somewhere in a light infantry company 3 states away, Torres was watching the grass. Somewhere in an IG office, a review was still running through 12 files, one name at a time. Somewhere in a classified research study dated 1971, a paragraph had been written that had been waiting 53 years for a correction that was now, at last, in the record. And in a flat terrain range corridor at the edge of a training complex with no unit crest above the door, Maya Blackwood sighted in on a target at 980 meters, rid the wind, found the moment between the gusts, and made the shot. Not because anyone was watching, not because the score was recorded, because the target was there, and the distance was known, and she had everything she needed to make it fall. She breathed out. She squeezed. The target fell. The ones who doubt you the loudest are often just afraid